On a spring morning in March 1220, the sun ascended over Samarkand, revealing one of the globe's grandest metropolises. This Silk Road treasure, home to nearly 250,000 inhabitants, shimmered with azure domes and bustling marketplaces where Chinese traders bartered with European caravans. Aqueducts carried pristine water from distant peaks, nourishing the verdant gardens that transformed this desert locale into an oasis. Yet, this particular day held a different aura. An unusual sound resonated beyond the city walls, neither thunder nor wind. The synchronized thud of countless hooves intensified with each heartbeat. From the ramparts, sentinels squinted through the morning haze, their blood curdling at the sight. An army approached from the Kaselkum Desert, emerging from a wasteland previously deemed impassable. Banners emblazoned with esoteric symbols flapped in the breeze. The immense dust cloud trailing behind them hinted at a force of unimaginable scale. Within 7 days, this magnificent urban center would be reduced to smoldering rubble, its streets awash with blood. The haunting question for all who witnessed the impending invasion was stark. How does one combat an adversary capable of the impossible? This narrative chronicles Genghis Khan's annihilation of the Persian Empire. Before delving into the bloodshed, it's crucial to grasp how Central Asia's mightiest empire incited the wrath of history's most feared conqueror. And believe me, the subsequent account offers a prime example of how not to conduct diplomatic affairs. 2 years prior, in 1218, Shah Muhammad II of Khwarazm seemingly enjoyed an unblemished reign. His dominion stretched from the Aral Sea to the Persian Gulf, encompassing the world's most lucrative trade routes. With an estimated 5 million subjects, he held sway over fabled cities like Bukhara, Herat, and Samarkand. He had just successfully subdued his rivals, the Ghurids, and even the formidable Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad had recognized his authority. Muhammad was not merely self-assured, he was arrogant. Thus, when a Mongol trade caravan arrived at the border city of Otrar, laden with jade, ivory, gold, and white camel hair cloaks, gifts from Genghis Khan, the Shah's uncle and governor, Inalchuk, made a historically reverberating decision. He accused the merchants of espionage. Then, he ordered their execution and confiscated all their possessions. Let me be explicit. In the medieval era, killing merchants was ill-advised. Killing merchants from a powerful neighboring state was disastrous. But what followed was an absolute catastrophe. Genghis Khan, striving to preserve diplomatic relations, dispatched 3 envoys to afford the Shah an opportunity to rectify the situation. Hand over the governor, punish him for his transgression, and perhaps all parties could move forward. The Shah's reply? He executed one of the envoys, potentially all 3, depending on the source, and sent their bodies back to Mongolia. It's imperative to understand the gravity of this act. In nomadic cultures, envoys were sacrosanct. The murder of an ambassador was not merely an insult. It was a declaration that civilized norms no longer applied. And what truly baffles me about this entire episode is that we don't know if Muhammad genuinely desired war or was simply incredibly foolish. Some historians propose he sought conflict, believing the Mongols were just another tribal group he could easily subjugate. Others suggest he utterly failed to comprehend the cataclysm he was inviting upon his empire. In either scenario, Genghis Khan's retaliation was swift and merciless. He amassed an army estimated between 100,000 and 150,000 warriors and crossed the Jaxartes River in 1219. However, this invasion distinguished itself from every previous nomadic raid in history. He brought with him an entire corps of Chinese siege engineers equipped with the most advanced military technology of the era. The Khwarazmians were about to discover that these were not merely horse archers. They brought gunpowder, sophisticated catapults, and centuries of Chinese expertise in breaching urban defenses. If you're finding this exploration into one of history's most brutal campaigns engaging, please hit that like button and subscribe. We're only just beginning, and what unfolds next makes Game of Thrones seem like a children's story. Before reaching Samarkand, it's essential to understand the true nature of Genghis Khan, as Hollywood has done him a great disservice. Yes, he was brutal. Yes, his campaigns resulted in millions of deaths. But to label him merely a barbarian warlord is akin to describing Einstein as just some guy who was good at math. What truly rendered Genghis terrifying was not his savagery, but his intellect. The Mongol military was organized with a precision that would remain unmatched in Europe for another 5 centuries. Every unit adhered to a decimal system: squads of 10, companies of 100, battalions of 1,000, and divisions of 10,000, known as tumens. Soldiers were not grouped by tribal affiliation or lineage, but by merit and functional ability. If you possessed talent, you could ascend from humble origins to command thousands. This leadership system fostered a military where competence, not lineage, commanded allegiance. Yet Genghis Khan's true brilliance shone through his capacity to learn from every conquest. Following setbacks against the fortified cities of northern China starting in 1211, he didn't merely withdraw. Instead, he enlisted Chinese engineers, meticulously studied their siege tactics, and integrated their technological advancements. His forces deployed traction catapults, capable of launching 100-pound stones with extraordinary precision. One chronicler marveled that these mangonel operators possessed such accuracy they could guide a camel through the eye of a needle. They also wielded flamethrowers fueled by naphtha, primitive grenades packed with gunpowder, and the ho chong, a Chinese mortar essentially serving as an early cannon. What truly captivates me about military history is this: technology alone never dictates victory. It's the strategic application that matters. The Mongols seamlessly blended these siege engines with psychological warfare centuries ahead of its time. They didn't just attack cities, they instilled sheer terror. A grim preview of their methods was delivered to Samarkand in February 1220 with their assault on Bukhara. Bukhara was no ordinary urban center. Home to 300,000 residents, it was celebrated as the Dome of Islam in the East, a hub of erudition and culture that rivaled even Baghdad. When the Mongol army materialized from the supposedly impassable Kizil-Kum desert, the city was utterly bewildered. They had anticipated a Mongol advance from the east, along conventional trade routes, not a phantom-like emergence from an arid wasteland. The garrison's fatal miscalculation occurred on the second day. Believing they could disrupt the siege with a sortie, they galloped out of the gates with their cavalry. The Mongols executed their signature maneuver, a feigned retreat. The Khwarazmian cavalry, sensing triumph, pursued them further and further from the city walls. Then, the Mongols abruptly turned, encircling them. The ensuing carnage was absolute. The few survivors stumbled back to discover their city's lower district had already capitulated. The citadel resisted for 12 days before the Mongol forces breached its defenses. What transpired next established the brutal precedent for the entire campaign. Every single individual who had sought refuge within the citadel was summarily executed, without exception. The Mongols then sorted the remaining populace. Artisans were dispatched to Mongolia, where their expertise would be valuable. Young men were forcibly conscripted into the Mongol army, destined to become cannon fodder in future sieges, and everyone else was divided among the soldiers as slaves. Afterward, they plundered the city, and according to historical accounts, a fire erupted that reduced the majority of Bukhara to ashes. One narrative recounts Genghis Khan assembling the wealthy citizens in Bukhara's Grand Mosque and delivering what is arguably history's most chilling address. "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether these words were actually uttered by him or embellished later by Persian chroniclers seeking to rationalize the catastrophe, they encapsulate a fundamental aspect of how the Mongols perceived themselves: as forces of nature, irresistible and inevitable. News of Bukhara's fate propagated rapidly, and here lies the critical detail that Samarkand's defenders could not afford to disregard. The Mongols had taken 30,000 survivors from Bukhara and compelled them to march with the army. These captives were not merely porters, They would serve as human shields in the subsequent siege, driven ahead to absorb volleys of arrows and crossbow bolts, while Mongol engineers positioned their devastating siege weaponry. As reports reached Samarkand, detailing columns of Mongol cavalry and thousands of terrified prisoners advancing westward, the city's destiny appeared sealed. However, Shah Muhammad II was on the verge of making a series of strategic blunders that military historians continue to debate today. Decisions so monumentally flawed, they've become quintessential examples of how not to defend an empire. Let me set the scene for what Samarkand epitomized in 1220. Imagine the economic might of New York, the cultural eminence of Paris, and the defensive capabilities of an impregnable fortress, combined, and you begin to grasp its significance. The city straddled the Zarafshan River, its formidable walls safeguarding an estimated population of 200,000 to 300,000 inhabitants. These were not flimsy mud brick fortifications. These were imposing defenses that had repelled armies for centuries. Within these walls, Shah Muhammad had amassed a garrison that truly ought to have been able to withstand any siege. Modern estimates fluctuate wildly, from as few as 20,000 to as many as 40,000 seasoned soldiers, supplemented by tens of thousands more militia and armed citizens. Yet what rendered Samarkand's defenders truly formidable was their complement of 20 war elephants, armored titans that had instilled dread on battlefields from India to Persia for over a millennium. These were more than just animals. They were living tanks, protected by plating and carrying warriors on their backs who could unleash a torrent of arrows upon any assailant. The garrison in Samarkand also comprised elite Turo-Iranian heavy cavalry, widely recognized as some of the most skilled horsemen globally, along with sufficient supplies to endure a prolonged siege for months. In theory, Samarkand should have been impenetrable, halting the Mongol advance. So what went wrong? Shah Muhammad II committed 3 grave errors. It's crucial to understand these mistakes as they exemplify how arrogance and apprehension can dismantle empires. Firstly, instead of consolidating his forces into a formidable army capable of confronting the Mongols directly, he dispersed them. He stationed troops in Samarkand, Balkh, Otrar, and numerous other cities, spreading his strength so thinly that no single contingent could effectively challenge the Mongol Tumans. His rationale was that the Mongols were merely engaged in a typical nomadic raid, expecting them to pillage the countryside, perhaps besiege 1 or 2 cities, and then retreat as winter approached. He failed to comprehend that he was facing an adversary that had spent 9 years perfecting the art of breaching fortified cities in northern China. Secondly, he inadvertently created a leadership vacuum that crippled decision-making. Muhammad harbored a deep distrust of his commanders, placing his sole confidence in his eldest son, Jalal al-Din, who was stationed elsewhere. Concurrently, his mother, Turkin Khatun, wielded immense power, maintaining her own governmental office and palace, and every one of Muhammad's decrees required her countersignature. Historians have characterized their relationship as an uneasy partnership, marked by constant struggles for authority. This internal power struggle meant that when the Mongols attacked, there was no unified command structure to coordinate a defense. Thirdly, and this point remains particularly infuriating to consider, he severely underestimated his adversaries. Muhammad was certainly aware of the Mongols and their prowess in raiding. However, he had only ever encountered nomadic groups like the Kangli, who possessed no knowledge of siege warfare. The notion that these steppe warriors would bring along an entire corps of Chinese engineers, equipped with cutting-edge siege technology and potentially even early gunpowder weapons, never factored into his strategic calculations. When scouts reported that the Mongols were constructing catapults and siege towers, the Khwarazmian commanders were genuinely astonished. However, another critical factor, often overlooked, was internal divisions. A significant portion of Samarkand's garrison consisted of Turkic soldiers, recruited from the same steppe peoples as the Mongols themselves. Their allegiance to the Persian Shah was, at best, tenuous. According to the chronicler Ibn al-Athir, When the Mongols arrived, some Turkish soldiers reportedly remarked, "We are of their race. Why should we fight them?" This ethnic and cultural schism ultimately proved disastrous. By early March 1220, as the Mongols advanced from both banks of the Zarafshan River, Samarkand's defenders watched their impending doom with escalating dread. Genghis Khan's sons, Ogedei and Chagatai, having already subdued Otrar, rejoined their father with fresh troops. The Mongol force now numbered in the hundreds of thousands, including all their auxiliaries and conscripted prisoners from previous conquests. It was at this juncture that the Mongols demonstrated their mastery of psychological warfare. At the forefront of their columns marched 30,000 prisoners from Bukhara, carrying Mongol banners and clad in pieces of Mongol armor. From Samarkand's walls, the Mongol army appeared to be twice its actual size. Even more disheartening, the defenders could see the survivors of Bukhara, potentially people they knew, being driven forward like human chattel. The message was unmistakable. This is the fate of those who resist. If you were commanding Samarkand's defense, would you have chosen to defend the city or attempted a breakout? Share your thoughts in the comments. The decision the defenders made next would seal their destiny. The siege commenced on a spring morning, as Mongol cavalry completed the encirclement of Samarkand. Unlike typical steppe armies that would probe for weaknesses and then withdraw, these warriors dismounted and began the systematic process of siege warfare. Within hours, Chinese engineers were meticulously surveying the walls, calculating angles, and measuring distances. By nightfall, the initial siege engines were already under construction. It's important to grasp the true nature of medieval siege warfare, as cinematic portrayals often misrepresent it. This wasn't about dramatic clashes and heroic charges, it was about relentless, crushing terror. On the first day, the Mongols strategically positioned their traction catapults at calculated intervals around the city. These were not primitive contraptions, they were precision instruments operated by teams of men pulling synchronized ropes, capable of launching 100-pound stones with devastating accuracy. The bombardment began at dawn on the second day and continued without pause. No breaks for meals, no respite for sleep, ever. Hour after hour, day and night, stones whizzed through the air and slammed into Samarkand's walls. However, the Mongols were employing more than just rocks. They possessed _4_ volatile oil and sulfur concoctions that detonated upon impact, igniting structures. Their arsenal included incendiary arrows capable of penetrating deep into the urban core. Furthermore, some accounts indicate they employed _5_ rudimentary gunpowder mortars that generated immense noise and fire, though their destructive power couldn't rival later firearms. A chronicler once noted the Mongols' engineers could pinpoint specific sections of the wall with such accuracy that defenders were unable to mend the damage as quickly as it accumulated. Imagine being a soldier on those ramparts, witnessing fissures spread across ancient stone, acutely aware that each passing hour brought collapse nearer. Now compound that dread with perpetual bombardment, denying you any respite. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Within the city, panic was rampant. Survivors from Bukhara recounted grim tales of the Mongols' treatment of those who capitulated, let alone those who fought back. Provisions were still ample, but water supply became a growing concern as certain aqueducts had been severed. More distressingly, everyone could see the captives from Bukhara encamped at the Mongol army's forefront, understanding they would be forced forward during the assault. On the third day, Samarkand's commanders decided to act. They planned a forceful sortie to breach the Mongol lines, hoping either to scatter the besiegers or at least create sufficient disarray to impede the siege. It was a perilous gamble, one that might have succeeded against a conventional adversary. But this was no ordinary foe. At dawn, the gates swung open. First came the war elephants, 20 armored behemoths trumpeting their defiance as they charged toward the Mongol formations. Behind them surged thousands of elite Turco-Iranian heavy cavalry, warriors who had never tasted defeat. It must have been a majestic spectacle, a final desperate wager by an empire refusing a quiet demise. The Mongols responded precisely as they had at Bukhara, as they had in countless battles across Asia. They feigned retreat, their light cavalry falling back before the elephants, firing arrows but making no concerted effort to engage. To the Khwarazmians, it appeared to be a victory. Their elephants drove the Mongol cavalry before them. They advanced further from the walls, away from safety, committing more and more troops to the pursuit. That's when the trap sprang shut. Mongol heavy cavalry, previously hidden in geographical depressions on the flanks, suddenly emerged. The retreating light cavalry executed a practiced maneuver, wheeling around with precision. In an instant, the Khwarazmians found themselves encircled, with Mongol archers on all sides unleashing volleys of arrows from distances where counterfire was impossible. The war elephants, those magnificent beasts thought to be invincible, became liabilities. Panicked by the arrows and unable to reach their tormentors, some went berserk, trampling their own forces. Within an hour, the sortie had devolved into an utter catastrophe. Those who managed to return to the gates were fortunate. The Mongols intentionally permitted their retreat, understanding that the sight of thousands of broken soldiers stumbling back into the city would inflict more damage on morale than outright slaughter. The captured elephants, according to sources, were later released by Genghis Khan into the countryside, where they tragically starved to death because they couldn't find enough sustenance. Even in this small detail, there's a chilling, casual cruelty that is difficult to fathom. Following the abortive sortie, something inside Samarkand fractured. The next day, a significant portion of the garrison opened the gates and surrendered, hoping for clemency. They received none. Every last one of them was executed in full view of the city walls. The message was stark and unequivocal. Surrender meant death. Resistance also meant death. These were the only choices. At this juncture, the ethnic divisions previously mentioned became critically important. The Turkic soldiers within the garrison, witnessing their Persian comrades being butchered and hearing Mongol officers offer leniency in their native tongue, began to waver. Some accounts suggest Genghis Khan's spies had been circulating rumors that the Shah's mother, Turkan Khatan, had secretly aligned with the Mongols, exploiting known factionalism within the Khwarazmian leadership. Whether this was factual or not was irrelevant. What mattered was the erosion of trust within the city. Only the inner citadel maintained its resistance, a determined contingent of loyalists who recognized they had nothing to lose. For another month, they held out behind its formidable walls, launching desperate counterattacks and patching up damage with fervent speed. However, siege warfare is a question of logistics, not valor. Each day, the Mongol bombardment widened the breaches. Each night, sappers dug tunnels to compromise the foundations. It was simply a matter of time. Source language: English. A small contingent successfully breached the Mongol lines under the cover of night, making their escape across the Amudarya River, likely aided by Turkish soldiers on the siege line who sympathized with their plight. However, for everyone else, there was no avenue of retreat. Once the citadel eventually succumbed, the Mongols swarmed in for their conclusive retribution. On March 19, 1220, Samarkand, the famed jewel of the Silk Road and pearl of Central Asia, met its demise. Describing the events that unfolded after the city walls came down remains a harrowing task even after 8 centuries. The chronicler Juveni noted that Genghis Khan issued orders for the execution of everyone who had sought refuge within the citadel and the principal mosque. Not incarceration, not enslavement, but death. The thoroughfares turned crimson with blood, and the air of spring echoed with the cries of the dying. This was the grim consequence of defiance. Yet, the Mongols weren't merely blind agents of destruction. They possessed a pragmatic streak. From the surviving populace, they isolated 30,000 young men of military age, forcibly enlisting them into the Mongol army. These conscripts would subsequently be deployed in future sieges, precisely as the Bukhara prisoners had been utilized previously. Driven ahead as human shields, expendable cannon fodder to absorb the onslaught of enemy arrows and crossbow bolts. Another 30,000 individuals were identified as skilled craftsmen and artisans. These were considered assets. They were bound and transported eastward to Mongolia, where they would spend their remaining years manufacturing weaponry, armor, and luxury goods for their conquerors. Everyone else, the elderly, women, children, and unskilled laborers, was distributed among the Mongol soldiers as slaves. Some historical accounts indicate that the total fatalities in Samarkand alone may have climbed into the hundreds of thousands. While such medieval figures are notoriously unreliable, it is undeniably clear that a city of 250,000 inhabitants was left a smoldering, depopulated ruin. The Mongols then systematically plundered every valuable item: gold, silver, jewels, exquisite textiles. Anything portable was seized. Items that could not be transported were frequently destroyed, though it remains a point of contention whether the legendary fires that consumed a significant portion of the city were intentionally set or merely an accidental byproduct of the conflict. And where was Shah Muhammad II during this period of devastation? When Samarkand fell, he was already in flight westward with a small detachment of loyal soldiers, abandoning his empire to secure his own safety. Genghis Khan dispatched two of his most formidable generals, Subutai and Jebe, with instructions to pursue the Shah relentlessly. These two would orchestrate one of military history's most extraordinary campaigns of pursuit, chasing Muhammad across Persia and into the Caucasus region. The Shah moved from one city to another, constantly staying one step ahead of his pursuers, never pausing long enough to rally his forces or establish a defense. He had once governed an empire stretching from the Aral Sea to the Persian Gulf. Now he was a fugitive king with nowhere to conceal himself. By late 1220, ailing and utterly spent, he arrived at a small island in the Caspian Sea near the port of Abaskan. It was there, in December, that he passed away. The official diagnosis for his death was pleurisy, a lung infection. However, some chroniclers speculated he succumbed to the shock and profound sorrow of losing his vast empire. Consider this. In under 2 years, Muhammad transitioned from being among the world's most influential rulers to dying in isolation on a desolate, wind-swept island. His empire was shattered, his cities aflame, and his populace dispersed. Whether his demise was due to illness or a broken spirit, the ultimate outcome remained identical. The Khwarazmian Empire perished with him. Nevertheless, Genghis Khan's campaign of conquest was far from concluded. After Samarkand's fall, he divided his forces and initiated a campaign of systematic ruin across Khwarazm that beggars belief. His youngest son, Tolui, was assigned the task of devastating the major cities of eastern Persia. Herat, Nishapur, and Merv, 3 of the largest and most prosperous urban centers globally at that time, were each besieged and annihilated in succession. The siege of Nishapur stands out for its sheer horror. The city had previously withstood Mongol assaults and had been responsible for the death of one of Genghis Khan's favored sons-in-law. When it finally capitulated, Tolui commanded the slaughter of every living being within the city walls: men, women, children, even domestic animals like cats and dogs. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing soon after the events, asserted that each Mongol soldier was tasked with executing between 300 and 400 individuals. While this statistic is undoubtedly an exaggeration, the contemporary historian Atta Malik Juvaini recorded that a cleric spent 13 days counting corpses, arriving at a figure of 1.3 million dead. Even accounting for the medieval tendency to inflate numbers, the scale of the massacre was genocidal. What I find most astounding when studying this historical period is the Mongols' complete subversion of conventional military wisdom. In 1219, the Khwarazmian Empire stood at its zenith, possessing immeasurable wealth, formidable armies, and fortified cities that had never yielded to nomadic steppe tribes. 2 years later, it had ceased to exist, not weakened, not diminished, but utterly annihilated. And the terrifying truth is that this was merely the prelude. Genghis Khan's domain ultimately expanded into the most extensive contiguous land empire ever known, dwarfing the Roman Empire at its zenith by double. So, what pertinent lessons can we glean from this devastating episode? History isn't merely a chronicle of events, it illuminates the underlying causes and the wisdom we can extract. Firstly, while technology holds significance, organizational prowess proves even more critical. The Khwarazmians commanded courageous soldiers, formidable defenses, and war elephants. The Mongols, conversely, deployed catapults, Chinese engineers, and possibly nascent gunpowder armaments. Nevertheless, the decisive factor was their organizational superiority. The Mongol army operated with a cohesion of command and purpose that the fragmented Khwarazmian forces could never emulate. When Shah Muhammad dispersed his troops across numerous cities, he sealed their collective doom. The Mongols could then concentrate overwhelming power against each objective sequentially, rendering the dispersed Khwarazmian garrisons incapable of mutual support. Secondly, intelligence gathering and psychological operations can be as impactful as conventional weaponry. The Mongols didn't just assault cities, they instilled terror. They propagated rumors, exploited ethnic and political schisms, and repurposed survivors from previous sieges as both human shields and grim illustrations of the fate awaiting resistors. By the time they reached a new city, half the psychological battle was already won. Thirdly, and this point resonates deeply, underestimating one's adversary invariably leads to catastrophe. Shah Muhammad mistakenly believed he was contending with typical steppe marauders who would depart after plundering. He utterly failed to grasp that Genghis Khan had meticulously studied Chinese siege tactics for 9 years and brought that advanced expertise to Central Asia. His inability to comprehend his opponent ultimately cost him everything. Yet what's truly remarkable about Samarkand's narrative is that its story didn't conclude in 1220. The city was resurrected, and in 1370 it ascended to become the capital of another formidable conqueror, Timur, also recognized as Tamerlane. Ironically, Timur asserted lineage from Genghis Khan and adopted many of the same military strategies. Under his dominion, Samarkand arguably surpassed its former magnificence before the Mongol devastation. The breathtaking architecture that draws tourists today, such as Registan Square and Bibi Khanim Mosque, were constructed by Timur in the late 14th century. This raises a disquieting question that historians continue to debate. Did the Mongol conquests, despite their inherent brutality, ultimately confer long-term benefits upon the world? They razed countless cities and caused millions of deaths, undeniably. However, they also forged the largest free trade zone in history, facilitating the widespread dissemination of technology, concepts, and commodities from China to Europe. Gunpowder, printing, and paper currency all disseminated westward along Mongol trade routes. The Pax Mongolica, the era of Mongol peace, rendered the Silk Road more secure than it had been for centuries. I am not suggesting that the ends justified the means. The suffering was profoundly real, the death toll staggering, and entire civilizations were obliterated. But I contend that history is inherently complex. The very empire that orchestrated the massacre at Samarkand also unwittingly created conditions that would eventually catalyze the European Renaissance and the propagation of world-altering technologies. For the inhabitants of Samarkand in March 1220, however, these prospective benefits held no meaning. They endured one of humanity's most heinous atrocities, a 7-day nightmare that left their city in ruins and their civilization in ashes. Estimates for the total death toll from the Mongol invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire reach into the millions, with some scholars indicating that Central Asia's population took over a century to recover to pre-invasion levels. One final, lingering thought from this account. It all originated from a governor in Otrar executing merchants and a Shah making the disastrous decision to kill diplomatic envoys. Two seemingly minor decisions by arrogant individuals who believed themselves invincible led to the complete obliteration of one of the world's great empires. It serves as a potent reminder that in international relations, in warfare, and in leadership, minute choices can unleash world-shattering repercussions. The desolate remains of Samarkand in March 1220 served as a stark emblem of what transpires when empires grow complacent, when leaders underestimate their foes, and when established rules of warfare confront something entirely unprecedented. Genghis Khan's conquest of Central Asia represented a pivotal moment in global history. The instant it became unequivocally clear that the era of isolated civilizations was drawing to a close, and a new, more interconnected, and more perilous world was emerging. If this deep exploration into medieval conflict and the collapse of empires has ignited your curiosity, I invite you to take 3 actions. Firstly, hit that subscribe button, as we'll be delving into more of history's most savage and captivating clashes. Secondly, tap the like button if you wish to see additional content of this nature. And thirdly, leave a comment informing me which historical battle or siege you'd like me to cover next. Perhaps the Siege of Constantinople, the Mongol invasion of Japan, or the fall of Baghdad. The ideas you put forward genuinely determine our future creations. It's important to recall that individuals who fail to grasp lessons from the past are bound to relive its mistakes. And if there is one crucial takeaway from the tale of Samarkand, it is this: always consider your adversary to be formidable. Avoid splitting your troops when confronted by a cohesive danger, and under no circumstances should you ever harm a diplomatic envoy.